I'm very excited to introduce you all to our speakers today from Multi-Studio. I'm personally very eager to learn more about all the work that they're doing around the subject matter, and I hope you get quite a lot of content from it as well. So with us today, we have Michael Ralph, him. He's a vice president and director of research with Multi-Studio. He earned recently his PhD in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Kansas. He uses his background both in K-12 and higher education instructor to connect research to issues of practice and experience within the classrooms, with a focus on equitable application of quantitative methods as a tool for improved teaching and dismantling barriers to success for historically marginalized groups. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Also with
Thank
us, yeah, thank you. And also with us is Joshua Kell. They is a senior associate and architectural designer working in the San Francisco office of Multi-Studio. He earned a Master's of Architecture at the University of Michigan and a Bachelor's of Arts in Architecture from Clemson University. He also works on K-12 and higher education projects, as well as public space and multifamily mixed-use towers. He designs through a lens of equity and civic and environmental sustainability, including methods to track and remove red list chemicals from interior building materials. Welcome, Joshua. And again, thank you both for your time. I'm going to turn it to you now to share with us all the awesome things you have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll get this started for everyone. Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending and for allowing us to speak with y'all today. We are really excited to share this this research that we developed together between Michael and I, as well as a larger architectural team that we'll credit later, coupled with cost estimators and an MEP and fire protection team. So we were working with primarily, so just to kind of jump in about the background of this project, actually, this was actually an inclusive policy brief that we developed with a community college district in California. The intent of this research was to develop a way for the community college district to approach, design, and implement inclusive restrooms within modernization projects, as well as new constructions within their facilities. They understood that they themselves, we were working with a facilities manager project team, which their project manager team was primarily architects, but they understood and were humble and wise to the idea that they were not up to date on the kind of where inclusive restroom systems are, coupled with a lot of the discussions around gender identity, gender expression, and gender fluidity. So they came to us and asked us to develop a policy brief, and it really was developed in collaboration with them. So we do want to thank them, but they've asked to be anonymous through this course. So I'm going to hand it off to Michael first to speak about what are inclusive restrooms, and also speak around some of the politics around the language. So feel free to tell me to shift slides, Michael.
Yeah, will do. Thank you. And I think to start at the very beginning of this whole project, where we brought our team together, and that team included all of these people that Joshua said we're going to share later on. One of the first things that we identified is where we certainly had a clear directive towards the end of this project that we needed to have design applications. This needed to have relevance for their project managers and relevance for their future facilities. But what we also discovered very quickly on was we needed to get on the same page with everybody on the project about what words mean things. And that's particularly important, I would argue, because words shape thought. And so you may say we're talking about semantics at the beginning, and I would say semantics are important. And so that's something that very early on we developed a glossary of terms to be able to very precisely to define what we're talking about, and also their relationship to one another. And it's going to have some design implications very shortly. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And so we'll start by even talking about they were considered considering different ways to look at gender in their restroom systems. And so we needed to set apart what is gender and what is sex, because they are different things. And particularly what is most relevant in most of this project was looking at the role of gender, which is a social construct. And so it arises from sex, which is itself the result of things like chromosomes, like genes, like hormones, like anatomy, lots of different pieces that all are informing how we understand a person's sex. And then all of that within a social context gives rise to gender, and they're distinct. And also they sit in relationship to these other things that are also something we have to consider when we're looking at designing restroom systems, things like a transgender identity and a cisgender identity. Which of those is a user bringing with them into that space? Also thinking about gender more inclusively, and so think about it as a breadth of possible identities. It includes I am a man. It can include being a woman. It can also include being a gender non-binary is the term that we use to describe people who were not a man and are not a woman. And there are other categories as well. And so laying out some of those terms and their relationships to one another and what combinations of those identities users might bring with them into the space was an important early step in this project. And that has implications in thinking about even things like signage. Let's go to the next slide. As we looked at, this is just the result of some early web searches of how do different clients talk about what restrooms are they going to post for the people in their facilities to use. And there are a lot of different strategies out there right now. This is just an early spread of different approaches. And as we started to look at the way these things were being represented, they're describing either different approaches to talk about gender in their representation. You can see in the top left corner, gender neutral restroom. And it is evoking something that is, even though there are 3 images there, it is still pretty concretely evoking a binary conception of gender, a dichotomy of gender, versus other approaches that go all the way to, you can see the inclusive there in the middle, and on the bottom left, it's recognizing inclusion for people with disabilities is another piece of something that they might want to communicate, all the way to the bottom right. That is, of course, it's playful. That's their attempt to be fun, I think, talking about everybody is welcome in this space, but also that signage doesn't tell you very much about what's actually in that space. And so that's something else that we have to think about, is what are we trying to communicate and how can we most effectively communicate that? And so early on in our project, and this was actually something that was led by the intern working on that project, who had a considerable amount of lived experience and expertise through their schooling on this topic, who really walked the team through considering how we were going to talk about our restroom systems. And in particular, we were looking at in the realized built version of the project, they use gendered restroom system, gendered multi-user restroom systems. And so a men's restroom with multiple fixtures and a women's restroom with multiple fixtures. And what we moved towards was it's a very common to be using gender neutral as another designation for ungendered systems, but that's still the term neutrality evokes pushing out or removing from the equation. And particularly we didn't want to push anybody out from the systems that we were considering, or from the systems we were going to help the client consider. And so neutrality wasn't exactly what we thought we were trying to design for. And so moving towards all gender is another term that includes it discards the gender dichotomy. That is that false conception of how gender can work, but still centers gender. It makes gender very salient as I'm considering using the restroom. I just want to go in and use a toilet, and now I have to be thinking about my gender identity in order to be able to go in and just use a toilet. And so instead, what we move towards, and what you will hear us use throughout the remainder of this presentation, is inclusive restrooms. And we have not used the term gender inclusive restrooms, and that is both to try to allow anybody to be able to use a restroom without having to perform their gender as a part of that usage experience, but then also to recognize that inclusion exists across a variety of identities in humanity. Gender is most salient for us in our project right now, but inclusion is also relative to people with disabilities. That's also relative to race and ethnicity. There are a lot of considerations for inclusion, and so just centering inclusion as our designation was something that we decided we wanted to use moving forward. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I made that reference to inclusion across multiple axes of identity. And that was something that was a key piece of, again, the study and the material that we delivered to the client. Was the client said at a couple of our conversations, they said, this is this new consideration, this new idea of thinking about inclusive restrooms and who's going to be in these restrooms. And we had said, well, let's study what has the development of public restrooms looked like in the United States over the course of the last 250 years, because it is not new. It isn't new. And so being able to go back, and we actually constructed a historical timeline with contextualizing information, and we'll go into some of those details here in a little bit, but we really wanted to put that up front in this talk today, because we want to recognize from the very beginning that advocates for inclusion in public facilities have been doing this work, been engaged in these conversations for generations with regard to, as you can see early on in the all the way back to the 1880s with very early gendered systems, that at that time, that conversation was very different than it is right now, and talking about gendered systems as a mechanism of inclusion, and then moving forward through time in considering how we can integrate and approach restroom systems to be inclusive across race with regard to people with disabilities and a variety of different identities. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so bringing it all the way to the implications for this project and this study, and what Joshua is going to unpack for us here in just a moment, is as we were engaged in these design iterations and thinking about different approaches to creating restroom systems in facilities, what we were really focused on was thinking about the different fixtures, the different amenities, the different things that are in those spaces that people may choose to use across a variety of gender identities or other identities, and how can we approach providing access to all of those services, all of those activities in ways that are safe, in ways that are accessible, and for lots of people who come from lots of different lived experiences. And so what I think you're going to see here in the next few slides is the implications for architecture and design with regard to providing access to services and facilities that are focusing on those activities that the services and facilities are providing, because that is the point of the designs. Joshua, go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. So as a part of this study, we realized that we needed to, we had to have some modes of analysis. I mean, this was really about very pragmatic means of actually, developing a standard operating procedure for the client, and how to initiate these within their community college district for facilities across multiple areas. So we really sought a method of using benchmarking as a way to kind of give the clients some actually more concrete data about how shifts in the design and the layout from a gendered system, which you see here, would then potentially be different if it was an inclusive restroom. And some of the things that operate within inclusive restrooms are, yes, we can share accessories. We can share such as like baby changing tables. So instead of having to buy two, you can buy one. ADA stalls, you would have one restroom, one accessible stall, one ambulatory stall, if all 10 toilet fixtures were together. Some of these things are, so the benefits begin to start adding up, especially when you think about the accessibility spaces that are required by Title 24 and Chapter 11B of the California Building Code. So one of the primary typological shifts from gendered systems to inclusive systems is the fact that there is a question of what needs to be private and what can be public. So when it's public, we obviously have a greater sense of safety, given the fact that there is public view access, sometimes from the corridor, which you would have, say, in a K through 12 school. Typically in California, actually not typically, but it's illegal for teachers to actually come into restroom spaces by students. So for say something like layout B, a teacher can actually stand on the outside without actually entering this space, but then still supervise that shared area, which would deter any sort of negative behavior. But then so for layout A, this might be great for a community college because you still have some partitioning away from a hallway corridor, but then of course the entire area is pretty open, and if there is an emergency, then acoustically you'll be able to hear it. And then layout C is actually more of a kind of a pass-through system. This was actually developed by Stalled, which is an organization that Michael will speak about later because we interviewed the director as part of the qualitative data research that we did. So again, it really is about deciding what needs to be public and what needs to be private. I always think about inclusive restrooms as latrines at a music festival, which is maybe not the best thing if you think about the cleanliness, but really it's kind of the same thing. You go into a private stall, you go in, do your business, and then you leave, and then you use a public lavatory that's shared by everyone. So going through here, we have this sort of red outline that we saw previously, and so this becomes part of the benchmark of what if we changed a gendered system to become an inclusive layout. And the reason why we had to do that is because for a new construction project, it's so difficult to actually parse out the actual expenses of, say, what an inclusive restroom would be versus a modernization. So we felt like that would actually be better given the fact that the community college district already had so much building stock. So you can see here a shared lavatory, everything's in publicly in view. We have gypsum walls. We do believe that having acoustical privacy is wiser, given the fact that you have that acoustical privacy in a full height door. But also what this does mean is that we are sharing, we're sharing the circulation space, which does potentially reduce our footprint. But what you're also getting is obviously you need to have MEP systems and fire protection systems that would service these individual rooms. So when we look at partition systems, part of the benefit from them is that you're actually able to share the lighting. You're typically able to share the fire sprinklers and whatnot. And you are sharing the ability for ventilation to come into these individual rooms. There are some ways to obviously move around this. So if you do when we're using gypsum walls, full height doors, there are discussions that you can have with your MEP team about the gap between the floor to allow for, say, a central area drain versus having an area drain within the stall. There are certainly ways to be creative with the design. But then for things like sprinklers and lighting, we move away from shared systems to individualized systems. So that does become a cost for modernizations that we want to account for. But when we look at the square footage that typically was required for a more efficient, inclusive layout, we found that it was less. And so in California, especially, as you know, square footage is significantly more costly a lot of times, and so we do have to consider that. We do consider that as a benefit. And you see here, like within this study that we developed, we really tried to standardize the components, ensuring that when we did have our estimator review all the different components coupled with the square footage and layout, that we were getting kind of like better considerations. So overall, though, we found within each of the different layouts, after presenting it to our MEP team and our fire protection team, and then they gave us their comments, and then we sent it to our estimator to kind of see what the sort of markup at the time of, this is July 2021. Obviously, with escalation for different components these days, we just don't know where these numbers lie, but we kind of wanted to give the client just a general sense of how much something's going to cost more versus for partial height partitions versus full height partitions versus gypsum wall partition walls. So utilizing these numbers then allows the staff to then make more informed decisions. So we can operate within a smaller footprint for an inclusive restroom since we are sharing circulation spaces and amenities. There is greater privacy, and I will say for K through 12 kids today, they are asking for greater privacy within their locker rooms and their restroom facilities. And they are actually way more open to inclusive restrooms than I would say adults are. There's a greater sense of belonging, and we can share accessories and coupled with we do recommend gypsum partition walls. But with your MEP and fire protection considerations, obviously there's going to be a differentiation between a modernization and new construction. For new construction, you can wrap these costs in pretty easily within the project, but for modernization, there might need to be further considerations. So I'm going to speak to, I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk about the research we did and how to utilize research, when discussing topics that have, currently we have a lot of disinformation in our news cycle right now about this, and how to really utilize this to attack stigma. So, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm gonna kind of stall here for a second while I vamp and just do a voice call for questions as a reiteration. If you all have questions or would like to ask for more elaboration on anything that we're sharing here, we're about halfway through. We're monitoring the chat. And so please feel free to engage if you've got something where you want to hear a little bit more. I know it's a lot of material and we're going through pretty quickly. And so I'm just vamping for just a second, just in case you want to get a question before we keep rolling. And one of the things why there's an entire research integration section, one of the things that we heard from the client, again, very early on, and was actually an important factor in even getting engaged on this project in the first place, was they're interested in things like cost, but also they're wanting to be able to come back to their community, their users, their constituency group, and be able to provide some information, some data in particular, to be able to help contextualize and support some of the decisions that they're making related to their facilities, especially in this context where there are people who feel very strongly and are very vocal, and some of whom are against implementing inclusive restroom systems. And so the client was very interested in having access to what I'm going to say as hard data to be able to justify some of the facility decisions that they're making. And so I want to call back to a piece of my bio where I think that it's important to critically analyze what is in our numbers. We as humans are creating the numbers and the statistics that we're using. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to equip the client to be able to ask, what are the most useful statistics? What are the most useful frequencies? What are the most useful questions that might generate data that we can analyze in such a way that we can then actually address the questions related to who's using our facilities and who has needs for things like safety and accessibility, rather than just trying to go on who is shouting the loudest, so to speak. And so that was a big piece of my role in particular on the project, was helping them explore what are the data that are available that can help us make facility decisions. I see I've got a question in the chat, and I'm gonna circle around and we'll answer that question when it fits into the rest of this, but I want to acknowledge I see it. And so can we go to the next slide, please? And so, and that's not going to be unique to this particular client. Looking just, again, a cursory internet search across institutions of higher education across this country. And it is very common, or it's very common that many of the institutions have comments, have material, have postings, have in their marketing, that they want to create inclusive campuses and inclusive cultures. And I think that's great. I've got nothing bad to say about that. And so one of the things that I think will be useful for all of us as we're working with clients wherever they may be in the country is being able to help them take some of those value statements and put them into action and be able to link them back to the data they have to help get some feedback loops going on what work is needed to be able to make concrete advancement towards those goals. And so that was a big piece of the work that we were doing together on this project. Let's go to the next slide. And that we have research to support unto itself. So I don't know how far we can go in this inception stacking of research on research, but this is a pretty key study that we were looking at, especially during the course of the project. And what they were looking at was the impact of engagement of the community to be able to support and sustain academic initiatives. Anybody who's worked in higher education, feel free to disagree with me if you like, but in my experience, there are plenty of initiatives that get started and then they fail to find buy-in from the community. They fail to achieve some of their goals because they can't get everybody on the same page, everybody to share a vision to be able to move in a particular direction. And so one of the things that we thought was going to be valuable is helping equip the client to identify what are the data sources, the data streams that they already have access to. And I want to reemphasize that we did not generate any unique data for this study, because if they're reliant on us, they're relying on me to go out and put out a survey, then they can't ever do it on their own, and we're not going to see institutional change. So instead, we wanted to equip them to do it on their own, autonomously, as an institution, to go use the data they're already generating, so that then they can engage their community to discuss the data that they have, what data they may want to collect moving forward, and thus generate a shared buy-in in their community that ultimately perhaps inclusive systems can play a role in developing that more inclusive culture that I think a lot of their users are interested in having. And so this research was to help equip them and reinforce and justify some of the things that I think that we were hearing from the client as well, and equipping them to be able to go and carry that message in a more persuasive way. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
And so the first thing I mentioned earlier was we developed this historical timeline to try to situate this consideration of different restroom systems in a historical context. And that was really important because, again, it can, and we heard this in some of our conversations, feel like this idea of inclusive restrooms is brand new to people who perhaps have not thought about it prior to a particular project engagement, prior to a particular workshop like this, prior to a particular moment. And so it can feel brand new. And and we believed it was important to equip the client to engage in some education with their community about the extensive history around conversations for inclusive restrooms and inclusive public spaces. And so one of the key stories that came out of this, what we ended up writing was a 4-page, 6-page historical brief that was written in accessible language. Our goal was that it would be accessible to a lay audience. It didn't require particular expertise either for architects or researchers or anything, but that anybody could read this narrative of a handful of pages and understand some of the stories from across the last several hundred years as as public restroom systems have been evolving. And so what you see on the screen here, that's a portrait of Jeanette Rankin, and she served as a representative in Congress in a facility where she didn't have a restroom she could use. Nowhere in the facility. She had to leave the facility to go somewhere else to be able to use a restroom because they were all gendered for men multi-user systems, and there was not one for her. And it's just a really good example this was from 1914, I think, was when this event was happening. And it's a really good example from that is not new. That is over 100 years ago when there were considerations of who are these restrooms for, who is this space intended to be used by, and foreseeing and designing for everybody who's going to be in that space. Let's go to the next slide. I see a second question. I've got 2 questions in the chat we'll come back to. Yeah, I see a code requirement. That'll be a really good one for Joshua when he gets a chance to see it. And so what we developed and what you see here is a piece of the more complete timeline that we actually delivered to the client. And what was important in this development was, again, remember early on, we were contextualizing this idea of inclusive restrooms being with regard to gender, but not limited only to gender identities. And so thinking about inclusion across gender, race, disability, and other elements of human identity was an important piece of constructing this larger, more interconnected narrative of how we've gotten to where we are right now, and laying out a variety of important events across that timeline. So that includes legislation that is literally requiring something or forbidding something from happening in a particular project, but also judicial precedents that play a similar role to legislation, but they're produced as interpretation of legislation. And so while they are binding, they are different than if we were to limit it only to laws that are being passed. Building codes, related to one of the questions that's in the chat already, building codes which are themselves evolving and are fairly different from one place to the next in across the country. And then even we also wanted to consider things that are less binding, social norms and expectations that are more culturally situated. And we also wanted to include some of that consideration in the full narrative that we developed. So how all of those things interplay to produce the human experience of being in a public space and then looking for a restroom when you need to use one. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so we engaged a variety of streams of data, and I want to lay those out for you here just real briefly in our conversation because they fit into several buckets. And the first couple of research sources were very specifically tied to the client's location, to the client themselves, the client institution. And so the first one was we wanted to help them identify what are some of the existing data sources for what the experience is like in their facilities and on campus. And so I said that we didn't do any new data collection, and that's true. But the client does data collection. This is common across a lot of higher education institutions, is they make, institutional office of research or institutional research. They have some organization, some department in the institution where they're regularly sending out surveys. They're regularly collecting data, and some of those data can be relevant to your project considerations of restroom systems. And we identified several of those sources in their specific data, and so that required engaging with their institutional office of research, looking at the kinds of surveys that they're fielding with their students and with their staff, both maintenance staff and instructional faculty, and looking at those results and simply just pulling out for them, you're interested in what impact inclusive restroom systems can have. Let's talk to this group. And we heard from the client they hadn't been engaging with those data sources to that point. And so take a look at some of these questions. This is just one example up on the screen where you can start to pick apart who is saying that they disagree that they are safe from health hazards at work, and what can we learn about the data that you already have for what's leading them to feel unsafe and related to health hazards. That might be something completely unrelated to restrooms, but it might have some connection to the restrooms that are available for them. And then that can set them up to have a conversation with the folks who are collecting these data to say, it would be really useful. Can you add a question or tweak this question, or let us know when you do the next round of data collection, so then we can draw those in and use those to inform our next project. I see another question in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye. It looks like it is also code related, so we'll do that. We'll do that when we get to that section. Let's go to the next slide. And so we wanted to pair those sorts of experiential type data sources, and in the local context, those were coming from their office of research. And also public safety was a really big deal to this particular client. They were very clear from the very beginning. They wanted to think about safety. They wanted to think about incidents, reportable incidents. They have an on-campus police unit that supports their public safety work, and they really made it clear they wanted to think about safety from the very beginning. And so one of the things that I learned a fair amount about as we were doing this project was working with their campus law enforcement to find out what kinds of data are they collecting about the incidents to which they respond, and where are those data found, because a lot of the data that was most useful, including what's on the screen here and right now, that's already required by law for them to be publicly reporting. And so it was just a matter of, through the course of several conversations with their leadership at the law enforcement branch, through several conversations with them, we learned that they were already collecting those data. They already had to aggregate it in a way that was really useful for this purpose, and they were posting it publicly. And so it was just a matter of equipping our client to know they have these data. This is who you talk to, and this is about when each year that they're going to be posting it, and about where they post it. So you can pull those data in with very little additional work to either your project managers. We'll come back to that. Either your project managers or the police department themselves. This is something that you can very easily engage on each of your future projects as a part of your standard procedure. Thank you. And so those sources of very localized data were something that we also, because you notice on the previous slide, we're talking about the order of 1, 2, or 3, a small number of incidents, which is great. We don't want incidents, but it's a little bit harder to look at patterns and to talk about experiences of folks for whom there are very few representatives on their particular campus. And so we wanted to help them contextualize that with larger scale studies that were working with the sample size necessary to be able to talk about general patterns and what's happening, so that they could then make plans for the future of their facilities. And that was particularly important as we were talking to them later on in the project. It was particularly important as they were imagining using the kinds of procedures we were developing for projects that were going to be in service for decades, is that they want to know what direction are we headed as a society. And that's very hard to extrapolate from one case or two cases. And so one of the things that we connected them to was the US Transgender Survey. At the time, the 2015 survey was the most current data source for them to incorporate. But that brief, which also has state breakdowns, including a California state breakdown, was really useful because there are specific sections. There's an entire section dedicated to restrooms, to public restroom use. And so helping them see what are the experiences of transgender users in particular in using public restrooms, because that's a consideration. Remember that transgender is not itself a gender identity, but it is relevant to people making a selection for a restroom system, especially when they're a gender, when you present them with gendered options. And so so pulling in these data and helping them understand where these kinds of studies and how they can find these kinds of studies was another key piece of what this project, it strove to educate them, to equip them to do this into the future. And another key piece of this is 2015 is going to age. We're coming up on 10 years here not too long, but the 2022 U.S. Transgender Survey was just conducted less than a year ago, and those results are not public yet, but they are forthcoming. And so that was another piece of what we delivered, was a very, very clear language walkthrough of how to do an updated search for this kind of data, so that they can use that same strategy, whether it be next year or 5 years from now or 15 years from now. And so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that they're going to be able to integrate, even without my help, be able to integrate the results from the 2022 U.S. Transgender Survey once those results are public. Let's go to the next slide. And then similarly, in the national level, we also wanted to help them engage with crime statistics, because public safety was a high priority for the client. And so again, the FBI publishes an annual report of what they call hate crime statistics, and it comes out every year, and you can go back for a number of years looking at the trends in these raw numbers, these kinds of results. And what we were able to bring back to the client was the school college location is consistently one of the top places where these identifiable hate crime reports are coming across a variety of definitions. Again, back to inclusion in the broadest possible definition. And so particularly for gender bias, it was the #2 most common location. And how they define gender bias was something that we wanted to the best of our ability, help them interrogate what that means. So what's getting reported and what is not getting reported, what's getting defined as a gender biased hate crime versus what may not be defined as a gender biased hate crime. And so these numbers are not by objective by any means, because that is not possible. These numbers and these categories are being constructed by humans, but these numbers are useful in helping them talk about who is actually being harmed in a restroom facility, who's actually at risk, and who are we designing for in order to improve their safety and the accessibility of those public facilities long term. Next slide, please. And so one other thing that we did, all of these were quantitative measures that we were integrating, but another piece of good research is contextualizing with a variety of perspectives and with some qualitative methods to be able to make connections between some of these data points so that they're not left to interpret all of this unto themselves. And so one of the things that we included in this process was also a relatively small number of structured interviews with perspectives that would be useful in contextualizing some of these findings, some of those design iterations that Joshua shared earlier. And so early on in the project, I conducted a focus group with all of their project managers who are currently working with the client to understand how are they using their procedures, what kinds of questions did they have, what was their level of comfort in addressing some of these questions. That informed a lot of our work in laying out the historical context and the glossary that we provided. And then late in the project, we conducted 2 structured interviews, the first of which is what you see on the screen, where we talked to Dr. Jenny Beeman. They're an expert in thinking about inclusion for transgender students on campuses. They work internationally. That's their area of scholarship. And so through that conversation, we were able to identify particularly how different design decisions, different institutional policies are having an impact on different potential users based on their wealth of experience in thinking about those issues and talking with people who have that lived experience. And so we created a transcript of that conversation, then distilled some of the major takeaways from that conversation to be able to connect back the original data that we were providing, the data sources that we identified, to those design considerations that we deliver and that Joshua will talk about here in just a moment. Let's go to the next slide. And we also had a conversation. We had a structured interview with an architect who had recently worked with our client, and so they had experience with some of their project considerations, and in particular, they had experience designing a facility that was implementing inclusive restroom systems as a part of the facility that they were creating. Tad is external; he's not affiliated with Multi Studio, and so was able to hopefully have a candid conversation with us. I believe that we succeeded in that, to be able to tell us what it was like engaging the community. What can their project managers expect as they go about engaging the different people who might be creating those facilities? What kinds of questions do they have? What are the things that, what are the issues that have come up in construction that maybe would be worth having an eye out for in the future, particularly in that short and medium term consideration? And so from a very utilitarian standpoint, helping us contextualize some of these different design iterations and approaches, and what can you expect if you were to do some of this? Because one of the key takeaways from this brief in working with the client, how they hoped to use it with their personnel, was making all these considerations feel a little more familiar, so they'd be comfortable engaging these conversations with their users as they were considering implementing these systems in a future project. And so let's talk about, I think, what did we actually deliver? What were the considerations that we were making in our overall recommendations? And so, Joshua, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, thank you. So through the scope of this project, I kind of mentioned it prior, but we were really focusing on analyzing, say, those individual designs and all the considerations through these 6 lenses. And this was even written in our contract and like basically set the stage for the entirety of this research. So we were looking at things through the lens of accessibilities, and this is particularly for disability, different levels of disability. And we did have cost, of course, then overall equity and inclusion. So again, this is going back to what Michael was saying about not just designing spaces for, centered on gender, but also considering all things. There was another arm to through the design iterations that we showed previously, but it was kind of another factor that we just felt in order for conciseness that we needed to just kind of keep as an aside. But we did look at including single user restrooms coupled with, the multi-user kind of layouts. This did open up different conversations around not only whether or not someone who maybe doesn't want to share spaces, in a more inclusive environment, allow someone to do that, but also if you are someone who just needs a little more space at the time, or if you have, we talked about people who have colonoscopy bags and people who or have require assistance in order to use restrooms. So this really opens up ideas around different levels of ableness as well as potentially age. We will also note that during our EDGAR conference, someone brought up the fact that our designs did not include adult changing tables. And this is something that is happening within the code at present. I believe theme parks are required now to have adult changing facilities within their restrooms. So we are just wanting to note that our standard code right now is actually kind of a baseline. It's a constantly moving marker, but it just kind of goes to show that what we do for the baseline versus being the most democratic system typically are still a little bit separate. We were looking at it through maintenance. So as Michael was saying, we were talking directly with the project manager group as well as facilities groups. And Tad Costerson himself has had these discussions before. So this was like a really great outlet to begin to showcase to the client, about the best ways to, look through that lens. Of course, privacy and safety we have touched on prior, but all these being considerations, and all that research was ultimately to demystify and bring everyone up to the same level of language and to give a certain level of comfort and confidence to their teams to really kind of initiate these conversations. Not everyone has the ability to kind of speak about these things because they don't potentially have the lived experience or haven't done an inclusive restroom brief, policy brief for community college district. So not everyone has that experience, but it was really about tooling people. So to really kind of allow them to be kind of the harbingers of this movement. So again, we developed a standard operating procedure for both a modernization project as well as new construction. Obviously with modernization, if anyone's ever done any sort of renovation project, you understand that there is like there's a whole process about identifying the resources of a project and understanding the bounds at which you can design. Obviously, depending on your budget, you're going to have different levels of ability and not. But for new construction, as we said prior, we definitely felt that it was something that could be way more wrapped in and typically could be a lot easier. But one thing that's shared, and I think Michael touched on it before, but one thing that we absolutely stressed to the client was the necessity of engaging the population of end users who would be working and learning there. We are finding that is just so necessary to do. Instead of having a client come to us who's funding a project to just give us, say, the programming, to work with the community itself to really develop that community, to develop that programming together. It honestly generates a shared vision, coupled with the fact that, again, the perceptions of who's in charge versus who is using can be very different. And our facility, the facilities manager who we were working with even said, I do not have the most up-to-date knowledge on all this, and I can't be, I'm not tooled enough to be the best advocate. So again, we really just do want to stress that the word of the people is just something that can be very powerful and to help substantiate any project that you work on, not just inclusive restrooms, but any project you work on, especially when the design team and potentially the rest of the project team doesn't have the same demographic background as the end users that you're working with. So I understand there's some questions about code, and we're happy to get to that, but since we're at the end, we'll wrap up. I would just say overall for this project, I think it was just very validating. I mean, we were working with a large portion of our team was LGBTQ. And so working with a group of individuals and working with Michael, who's done so many studies, it was just really humbling to really be fortified with research that could not only assist so many others, our end users, but also ourselves. So, I think that was really fantastic. Michael, did you want to share anything?
Yeah, this is, my research has looked at inclusion for a number of years now, but this was a really good opportunity for me to reflect on the influence of my lived experience on some of the assumptions that I was making and how the world works, how the world should work, how the world could work. And so in particular, being able to think about why do those things go together, or why does it have to be the way that it is? I'm a cisgendered white man. And so I recognize it's several places through the course of this project where I said, oh, that could be different. That's not the only way that we can do that. And that's the only way that I've ever done that. And it was a really good moment to be able to contextualize that in my own experience and continue to be more creative about the ways things could be. And so even I think regardless for how long we think about this, continuing to ask, what is the influence of my experience on the assumptions I'm making or the questions I'm asking or the data that I'm collecting is a good exercise. It's called reflexivity. And this was a good opportunity for me to identify some new places where I can continue to grow, and I look forward. I met and learned about several experts who've been advocates in this space for a long time. And I've enjoyed being able to follow their work since then and continue to learn from them.
And again, just to summarize, this is our team. Again, our Lauren Moss is our lead. She's done so much work with our education and equity projects, but many thanks to our reviewers. But of course, we worked with Interface Engineering and Cumming, who did our project estimating in the development of this research. So now we'll move on to Q&A. I think, Michael, do you want to? I guess I could pull it up.
Yeah, do you want to end the screen share, and that'll give you a second to maybe more easily engage the chat because I think several of these questions will be better answered by you than I think I know the answer, but you're the one who's got the most expertise on the subject. And so I know that we've got several questions in the chat. Somebody asked about thinking about integrating urinals into the spaces. We've got another question from Tan May. Asking about the code requirement for the number of accessible restrooms when there are multiple single points clustered, and then one more question that was private, asking about requirements for fixtures intended for men's multi-user systems and women's multi-user systems when you're using inclusive systems. So how do those fixture count requirements? What does that mean? And I sent the quote to you, Joshua, so that you can read exactly what they've asked. And so I'll hold my comments, Joshua. Any of the three of those?
Absolutely. So for the number of accessible restrooms required where multiple single rooms are clustered. So first of all, I believe it was in 2019, we showed it in the historical diagram, but the IBC now allows us to cluster basically single user washrooms, you know, a water closet, together in order to satisfy our fixture count. Typically, fixture count is defined by male and female and divided in half. But now the IBC says that if you cluster, then you can actually share the lavatory space and have the water closets there. The Title 24 puts a percentage on that. I believe it's 5%, if I'm correct, of the facilities have to be actually no, it's 10%. 10% has to be accessible, and then you have to have one ambulatory. So we went from five fixtures within a gendered restroom to 10 in a shared space. What you end up having is one accessible restroom, one ambulatory stall, and the rest can be regular. You can also separate that out. So if you do want to say have a single user restroom that is outside the shared space, technically you can have that. I will say though, just, you know, to separate out, say, the one ADA stall or one accessible stall to be a single user restroom, and then have the rest of them to be, obviously the ambulatory in there coupled with the regular single stalls. You know, we want to always ensure belonging. So while there may be benefits to doing that, just have some consideration about the fact that you're making someone who is already different to go to a different space. Obviously, for modernization, it might be better or worse. For the urinals, urinals are something that came up at the EDGER conference when we first presented this research. I'm actually personally a believer in them. Like, we've had a lot of discussions, and we spoke to B. Sanborn, who's a part of the DLR group, if y'all don't know them, that there's just a lot of benefits to just having standing area. I would say, it's just so funny, I always come back to event things, but I was just at a concert, and the female line for the restrooms was so long, and the men were just going in and out very quickly. And we already had women coming into our line using the stall. So it's just like, I think a lot of people just don't really care whether or not you see the back of them while they're using the restroom. I personally don't care. I think urinals can be designed in there very well to give greater speed to people using the restrooms, coupled with other, maintenance requirements.
Can I tack on just a little bit there, around around the experiential element, which was a piece where I was doing a lot of the thinking, because that was a topic that came up very, very in a very concrete way when I was talking with Dr. Beeman, and they expressed pretty much the exact opposite sentiment, which is funny because I agree, because I also like urinals just fine, but they were like they're terrible. There are so many people who don't like them. Why are we spending space on them? And I share that counter narrative, not to suggest that one way should be right and one way should be wrong, but to re-emphasize a plurality of voices and thinking about how people want to be in the space. And that I think it is useful to center, do we want to provide urinal access? What's the best way to provide urinal access, rather than linking it to, that was a big piece of how my thinking shifted over the course of the project, rather than linking it to a specific person or a specific other fixture that it may not need to be linked to. And as just one quick example, as we've continued to study this over the course, since we finished this project a couple of years ago, and I sit in Kansas, which is far away, and so code is going to be pretty different. But there's a place here in the area that had an approach to inclusive restrooms where they just had a urinal room. They have several subspaces that are inclusive restroom spaces that I think would very closely match the way that we were thinking about them here. And then they had a fourth subspace that is just urinals. And I thought that was really interesting because I was surprised that I was surprised when I saw it. But then I think back to your point of if it's a priority to have a space that is faster, then we can set up a space for that. And I don't know if that fits in with your codes. I think Rita, you have that question. You have that question also. But it's something else that I think we can be more creative in exploring how to provide those fixtures if that's something that's a priority for the client, without some of the assumptions of where they need to be or who they need to be used, by. And I'm going to acknowledge another private comment that I'm getting right now from the asker, who pointed out that urinals use less or even potentially no water, and that was something else that was at least in a general way on the mind of the client as they're thinking about durability of fixtures. So what's it cost to fix and replace parts? Especially, they brought up a recent example from their experience of touchless toilets and how they're expensive to fix. But if you want manual flush, those plungers have this set of maintenance problems. The conversation for another meeting. But the point being, there are some things that might be a priority for a client to integrate more. Maybe they want to do only urinals. Like that's all we're going to have, which is a silly example. But the idea of the whole point of our brief, and I think a lot of this talk, Joshua, correct me if I'm wrong, is that I don't think we were ever suggesting there is one definitive answer, but rather to provide this SOP, this operating procedure for asking the questions so they can identify what kind of fixture profile might be the best fit for their particular project.
Can everyone hear me? Michael went out for a second. I'm just kind of curious. Okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Michael. I completely agree. And again, this is where we really wanted to center engagement through the whole thing. I mean, it's just really important for you to ask your end users about, what they desire. You need to listen to their concerns. So again, and this is also why we are looking at the different partition systems. Like, again, not everything can be a perfect, typology where we could just like initiate these things. I've worked on a middle school here in Berkeley, and Berkeley is now saying all of their student restrooms will be inclusive from here henceforth, which is amazing. But the facility I was working on was not able to do it, and it was a total gut check at the time. It was just like you just really wanted to get it done. But because of the existing building, we just couldn't go through with it. But what we were able to provide to that student population was a third space, single user restrooms, coupled with more higher privacy stalls for the gendered restrooms. So there is just context to acknowledge, especially as we initiate these systems, specifically in like modernization projects where it's just more difficult to modify older buildings.
Yeah. We've only got a couple minutes left, I think. Can I hold space for Rita? You said you had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so with DSA being the agency with jurisdiction here in California for K through 14, have you come across any major issues with them? Usually the response we get is we're not going to implement the plumbing code, but I'm curious what their approach, if anything, what kind of friction, if anything, you may have encountered doing some of these community college projects.
Right. So I would say the thing that we learned is how it's amazing with DSA, just how you name things is just so important. So what we ended up doing, so we actually initiated inclusive restrooms within a college lobby dorm. And so this is I think I think the students had their own restrooms within their suites, but for the downstairs area, it was an inclusive restroom. And the thing that we had to do was just like label each water closet restroom. And so again, it always comes back to definitions with DSA. But then we were able to, utilize a new code that basically said it's okay to cluster restrooms together. And then there's no code that says that restricts you from sharing, say, lavatory access or having to have, things of such be separated. Some things that we do consider though further, even though DSA doesn't require it, is just, if you're providing you know, you want to make sure you're providing sanitary napkins, dispensers, and receptacles. So you have to do that throughout each restroom. So I think the only thing with DSA is just to make sure that each restroom kind of meets the same standards. So they're all just going to look alike, and any sort of shared accessories will be accessible to all. Especially given the fact, you know, there are men with vaginas, and so we need to make sure that they have equal access to those accessories, coupled with females who have vaginas and who menstruate. And I would say too, like for the middle school that we worked on, while we didn't provide sanitary napkin dispensers and receptacles within the male restrooms, we did provide them in the third spaces, so the gender neutral restrooms. And just note, the IBC does call restrooms without, you know, they call them gender neutral restrooms. I asked recently on the code talk why inclusive restroom was not considered, and they just kind of gave me well, this is the term we're using now. We would have to change a lot in order to get there. So there's still some, you know, like Michael was saying, the semantics around it is really important, but it's just part of the regular push that we're doing. Michael, do we have any other questions?
I think that we've addressed, at least briefly, everything that I see in the chat. I know that we're 2 minutes over, and so I think I'll hold anything else I've got. Thank you, Rita, for having us.
Yeah, thank you both for your time.